Welcome to In Real Time. I'm your host, Hunter, and today we have an incredibly special guest. This guy, I heard his name so many times before I actually met him. I was in youth ministry for about 3 years, I think, before I met him, and heard his name about every 6 months. This guy's a legend. And without further ado, Brian Kramer, or as everybody affectionately calls him, BK.
Yeah, I'll take that. I like
Yeah,
BK. Yep. But I
BK.
like Brian and
Yeah.
whatever else. I'll take it.
Are you the Burger King?
I do talk about my shirt sleeves as being the home of the Whopper.
that's
So
that's
it's
good.
not at all true. If you saw a better
That's,
shot of me, you would know there's no truth to that.
that's good though. I like that. So tell us a little bit about who you are. What are you about? Share your story a little bit.
Yeah. Um, I am a husband to a wife named Amy, and she's wonderful. And I'm so thankful for her. I have two daughters. The oldest is named Autumn. She's 24 years old, and she rents an apartment with some of her friends here in our city, which is Fort Wayne, Indiana. And then she has a little sister, our youngest daughter, Ruby. She's Chinese adoption, and she just finished her freshman year at Indiana Wesleyan University. We have a dog named Obi. He's a 13-year-old Wheaten Terrier, and he's feeling his years. I have been a youth pastor for this is 34th year, and this is the third church I've been in. The first one was in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, which is where I grew up, and it's the church that reached me. The second church, I was at a place called King Street Church for 17 years in South Central Pennsylvania, a town called Chambersburg. And now this is my 12th year here at Emmanuel Community Church in Fort Wayne. So I am the middle school youth pastor, and I also coach a girls volleyball team. I used to coach girls JV volleyball. This year is going to be my first year of coaching girls varsity volleyball.
That's exciting.
And we have practice tonight in a couple hours.
Nice.
It's an open gym.
Right.
So.
Right. Right. But if they don't show up, they're gonna sit. I get it. They're riding the pine.
I will say that I'm really careful about not holding them to that.
Yeah.
I mean, the opportunities are there to increase their skill if they want to. But if they don't, it honestly is all about your performance at tryouts.
Yeah.
So, not just performance, everything else, it's about tryouts.
Right.
So we try and keep it legitimate that way.
Yeah.
At least I do.
Yeah. So. That's awesome. So one of the heartbeat of this podcast is really highlighting and celebrating God's faithfulness in the lives of his people in real time. So I had the privilege several months ago to sit in on a large group discussion with some people at our church who had been meeting regularly, discussing launching a missional community branch of our church, just doing life together in a small group setting. And there was a guy who joined that meeting, hadn't been to any of the other meetings, was really navigating difficulties of having a relationship with his father who wasn't a believer. And then someone else in the group who had been going to these meetings for months had that same situation and was able to speak into his life. And at the end of the meeting, the facilitator asked, what is one thing that stuck out to you guys? And the thing that stuck out to me as a fly on the wall, an outsider, not a part of any of this, was we got to witness God's faithfulness in real time. God was being faithful in the lives of both of those men, in the lives of this group as they met, and it all kind of came into fruition in that singular moment. So that kind of fostered this podcast, which is an opportunity for us to celebrate how God's been faithful in our lives over the years, but also in its own little weird meta way, faithful right now for this opportunity for us to talk. So as we talk about God's faithfulness, have there been any situations, stories where you were just hyper aware of what God was doing.
Yeah. It's neat because last week we had our middle school mission trip,
Hmm.
and I took a group of students to Niagara Falls, New York State, and we served there for a week. All middle school kids. There were, I won't, we had adults and middle school kids, and I really look forward to these times. I like road trips.
Yeah,
I love being in vans with students. I really do. It's my favorite
yeah,
thing. Um, like long drives where we're all together and we're just chatting.
yeah.
And I like taking people new places. And Niagara Falls is even a new place for me. But
Okay.
we're going there for the purposes of our own discipleship and contributing to what God is doing in the Niagara Falls community.
Hmm.
That told, there are three things that stuck out to me. Number one, on Monday evening, which would be the first full day of our trip, we traveled the day before and had some evening stuff. We were doing a worship experience and we were walking around the room and they had scriptures taped to the wall. And Isaiah 41:10 was one of those passages. And I read it. And if you're listening to this or watching this, you can go look it up. I won't. Um, but God used that passage to speak to me powerfully about, I'm in charge this week, Brian, but at the same time we're doing this together. I want you to know that I got this. And I'm like, that's awesome. I know that the Lord just spoke to me through his word. I didn't tell anyone. I just treasured it.
Yeah.
Um, and here's what happened. I mean, there's a lot that happened. But that morning, there was a girl on our trip that was always somewhat unique in our ministry. She struggled with relationships. We weren't quite sure why, but you do everything you can to
Yep.
cultivate
Yep.
things with her life. And her mom came to myself and three of the women who were going to be leaders on the trip and said, "Hey, you need to know that my daughter is on the spectrum." And like nobody had ever told me.
Yeah.
And these women were like, "Oh, okay, thanks. It's good for us to know that." Now, I wish I'd known ahead of time because what we would do in our ministry is we would work really hard to find one person who would go just for her.
Yeah.
But we're loading up the vans. It's not going to happen.
This is like right now. Yeah.
Yeah. And she, because of all the stimulation that that kind of experience brings, it was way too much for her. And so the first day, the morning, she was just face down in the middle of a large cafeteria where not just our youth ministry, but the other youth ministries that joined us were eating. And she was just face down, lying on the floor, and people had to step around her, over her to get places. And some people were trying to comfort her and soothe her, but we knew she needed to be left alone.
Yeah.
She needed stimulation removed from her. So we're trying to manage all of that. And in the midst of this, one of my youth leaders, the one of the women that comes along, she says, "You know what? I'm a trained social worker. Um, I never knew this about her." She
Yeah.
said, I'm equipped to work with people who struggle in this way. So we left her alone. Everybody cleared. I mean, we were done with the meal. Everybody cleared out. And she just stayed with her for a period of time and was able to safely help her get up, which that was not going to happen. I'd been on the phone with mom and all that kind of stuff in the process.
Yeah.
But um, this adult woman, this mom, was exactly what this young woman needed on the trip. And I did not know it, but I had assigned them, not knowing exactly how the group should be made up, but the
Yeah.
night before I had assigned them to the same group. And there were other young people in that group whose siblings were on the spectrum. And it ended up being a pretty good experience for this young lady through the week. And I just saw God's faithfulness in that. That's not the only thing, though.
All right.
There was a young boy in our group um, who I knew his father had got in some legal trouble and is locked up.
Yep.
Um, So I knew throughout this week that I was just going to spend a little extra time with him. Just, hey, how's things going? He's never officially told me, so I don't know if he knows that I know. You have to kind of be
Right.
careful with that. And throughout the process of the week together, he does tell me, hey, this has been hard, and we pray, and that kind of thing. And I think he's having a good week. But on the way home, one of my other leaders who has had, I didn't know his full story either. As an adult, he's an adult man, he's a dad of a student and that kind of thing, but he himself had faced a very difficult childhood and adolescence, and had some legal issues too. Well, this young man ended up being in the smallest van as we were driving home. And because it's a cargo van.
Yeah.
So there's this adult driver, this man who I just described to you, one of the moms in the passenger side, and then just one bench seat. In that bench seat is 3 students, and they're all pretending to be asleep. But over this long drive, this guy starts telling the woman in the passenger side his story about some of his legal issues, but how God rescued him from that and has been at work in his life. Well, not only was this young man who I just mentioned to you have a dad that has some issues right now and is locked up. One of the boys recently had a sibling who had been locked up.
All right.
And they're asleep, but with one eye open, listening to this whole story. And so this is our whole mission trip week.
Yeah.
We get within 10, 15 minutes of the church to drop everybody off, and
Yeah.
all this is unfolding. And so my concern is I want to get the trash out of the vans. And
Right.
I'm not referring to the students. I'm talking of the literal trash on the seats.
Right.
And so we pull in and I'm helping. I'm like, all right, everybody clean out under your seats. We're going to throw it on the dumpster before you get picked up, that kind of stuff. So I
Yeah.
don't know these conversations are going on, but the one younger boy gets out of his car, runs over to his mom who's picking us up, drags her by the hand and says, you need to meet this guy. And this guy's like, what's going on? The guy that had told his story. And
Yeah.
he says, tell her the story you just told in the van. And everybody at this point is in tears.
Yeah.
And I'm with my van emptying out trash. And I walk over and the one mom comes up to me and says, not word for word, but you need to tell me what's going on here because this is amazing. And like, we didn't know. It was just God being faithful.
Yeah.
So those are some situations just last week.
Oh, that's so awesome.
Really cool. It was
Yeah.
neat. I celebrate that. And of course, with every trip, there's stuff that I kind of wish this wouldn't happen or that wouldn't happen.
Right.
But it was still, I was
No,
thankful to
that's
be
so
part of
cool.
it.
That's awesome. And those are like, I don't know if you feel the same way, but I'm more encouraged by God's faithfulness through the ministry stuff when I'm not directly involved.
Mm-hmm.
When it's God using another leader in a small group or another van on a mission trip, those like this past fall, I had a lot of those where I felt I was pretty disconnected because of stuff I was going through, but God was doing some big things in the ministry and in the lives of our students through other leaders, and that was extra encouraging to me. So that's awesome. I've been in that.
I agree with that.
Yeah. So the other thing I want to talk about is because we said you're a parent, you're a youth pastor, and you're a coach. There are a lot of tensions in youth ministry. I don't know if there is a greater tension in our American culture today than youth ministry and sports. I think it's one of the greatest rivalries in the history of the world. So I want to talk about that a little bit today.
Yeah.
So and I talked a couple weeks ago with Josh Lance about how every culture is different, every church is different, every city is different, but there are some similarities. And one of my frustrations, is that sports has taken our kids captive. It seems,
Yeah.
And so I just want to have a conversation about that. Do you see that? And how is your perspective how does your perspective as a coach inform how you attack it as a youth pastor?
Yeah, there's a lot of angles to approach that from, but I will say that there's two things. A younger youth pastor asked me last week, what are the challenges that we're facing in youth ministry today that weren't around when you started out? And there's a number of them. This is not going to shock anyone.
Yeah.
Um, One of them would be everything that comes along with the smartphone,
Oh
which
yeah.
you could group social media in that, and it's not all bad. You know, there's some good things about that, but by and large, it has absolutely crushed the mental health of young ladies in particular, but I would say adolescents. It's having to be on and available all the time, and everything else that goes along with it is one thing.
Yeah.
The other thing I would say would be the onset of sports culture,
Yeah.
or maybe even the development of sports culture. Uh, I think that the development of sports culture in the United States is related to, and I'm going to go back to Columbine.
All right.
A lot of people may not know exactly what it is, but it was maybe the first really big public school shooting.
Yeah.
I mean, now tragically, it seems like that's a regular basis, but back then, boy, it was huge.
Yeah.
I remember our youth ministry being crushed by that for weeks on end, and students needed to unpack what happened there. I was not a youth pastor in Colorado where it
Right.
happened. I was a youth pastor in, at the time, Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. And kids were just like, man, the place where we spend so much of our lives is not safe anymore. Um, I don't know how much you know about Columbine, but there also was a faith issue there. There was something going on, you know, with Christianity and that whole thing.
Right.
Um, and I won't go into great detail on it, but so that was part of it too. But it was so big that, I think it was maybe just within a year or two after that 9/11 happened. And we even had people in our church whose parents worked in the Pentagon, which was hit by a
Yeah.
plane.
Yeah.
But our students did not need to process it the way that the adults did in our church, because the students were like, well, we already know what it's like to be attacked
Right.
where we live. So we've gone through this already. That was pretty powerful.
That is.
However, that idea, the idea of that came along with it, with bullying, with safety. Are my kids safe? How can I
Mhm.
keep them safe? Combined with, the growing popularity of 24-hour news. And then the fact that it wasn't just one station, but there are other stations, and those stations had to stake out their own audiences. So they had to have something that grasped the attention and kept the attention.
Right.
Well, if anything happened, um, they would report on it, and they would report on it for a long period of time because they had to kind of find where news is.
Yeah.
So culturally, families are not feeling good about their kids being safe in a way that they haven't thought of before. Now they are hearing all these situations around the world, making them think that their nice suburb, or wherever they happen to live, is not a safe place for their kid to play outside.
Right.
Um, so here's what happens. Into that comes club sports, where club sports says, look, your kid's not safe. Well, they don't say it, but
Right.
parents feel like my kids aren't safe just playing outside in the neighborhood anymore. It would be a lot better for them to be in a place that's organized under adult supervision, um, and everybody's safety checked, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
I think that has a big part of what we see with club sports. And
Yeah.
now that's one angle.
Yep.
And I think that's a big angle. But I'll say this. One time I was in Central America, and I was with a group of young people on a mission trip, and we were directly across the street from a professional soccer stadium where we were staying. Now, not a particular nice, economically, it was not in a great situation. So I'm not talking about this beautiful stadium. It's just
Right.
this professional stadium. But like I like soccer. So I say something to some of the locals and I'm like, hey, would it be okay if there's a game while we're down here for these 2 weeks? If we go to the game or if I take my students? And they're like, we Christians don't go to games. And I'm like, well, what do you mean Christians don't go to soccer games? They're like, no, do you know what happens at those games? And um, eventually I did make it inside that stadium and I could see what they're talking about. Like different areas are fenced off with barbed wire and that kind of stuff because there's a lot of drunkenness
Mm-hmm.
or people under some sort of influence that's
Yeah.
not natural. And there's just a lot of fighting. And it does appear to be a pretty awful atmosphere. But it made me aware of something along the lines of, hey, this is um, there's this world that exists here that God's people have looked at and said, we need to stay separate from that. And I don't know that it's that way in the United States as much, but it can become to it. It is becoming increasingly difficult to distinguish um, sports from religious activity. Where its
Yeah.
own culture is created, and we need to look at that as people who primarily live in the kingdom of God and say, what do we do with this?
Yeah.
Um, we know it's not all a bad thing.
Right.
The Apostle Paul uses it as an illustration for perseverance in his writing,
Yeah.
you know, sports,
Yeah.
without saying, so it's not inherently a bad thing.
Right.
I enjoy it. I played collegiately. Um, I do enjoy coaching, um, but I'm aware of the difficulties. I've written a number of articles trying to help youth pastors and families to wrestle with its place in their lives. Um, and I would say there's two thoughts that kind of govern my approach to it.
Mm-hmm.
The first thought is this whole issue of identity. Who are you at the core?
Yeah.
And that's a huge deal. And I found that to be the most helpful thing. Is there is quite a difference between somebody who belongs to Jesus, who happens to be an athlete, and somebody who is an athlete that goes to church
Ooh,
when they can.
that's good. Yeah.
And um and so right away, it hopefully that approach takes it out of being legalistic,
Yeah.
like as a pastor saying you have to be at church 3 out of 4 times a month. You can only travel with your kids club team 1 time a month, but fortunately there's an online service you could connect to so you could check that box.
Yeah.
you know I'm uncomfortable with that approach.
Yeah.
And I think that is the approach of somebody whose identity is an athlete and God is just a part of it. But a person who lives primarily from the kingdom of God would say that, no, my identity is wrapped up in Christ. Um, I do enjoy sports, and sports is really good. Um, like for a lot of ways, like God created these bodies. Let's see what they can do.
Yeah.
Let's put a ball and a net in there and it's volleyball. Or let's put a ball in two originally peach baskets, but now hoops with glass behind it and
Yeah.
see what happens. Run back and forth. How about this field of grass with these two boxy goals at the end? What happens there?
Yeah.
Let's see what the human body can do. And you can actually be wowed by God anew, in situations like that. It can be worshipful.
Yeah.
Um, there are great things that come from competition that you can learn about yourself and you can learn about following Christ.
Yep.
But what is your identity? Because what you will inevitably have to do is say yes to some things and no to other things.
Yeah.
And uh, I mean, I like to walk alongside families in that regard, helping them to discern what to do and not do. Um, but always wanting to bring up the identity question is, who are you helping your child become? What are they rooting their identity in? What are you rooting your identity? Like, if your kid's good at this sport, are you becoming the person who's parents of that kid who's good at this sport? And are you getting too much ego from that?
Yeah.
If so, be careful. Um, so I don't know. There's tons and tons of applications. Um, but sports is a good thing, but our
Yeah.
fallenness affects it.
Yep.
Um, but
So
I
let me
think,
ask you this.
oh, go ahead.
Um, what if a parent comes up to you and says, "Look, we have been inundated in sports culture and we're in a little too deep. We're in over our heads. We know we need to peel back a little bit. We know we've not been prioritizing faith. We've not been prioritizing Christ. And because of it, our kids want nothing to do with church." What are some things you're going to say and discuss and work with that parent to help them kind of get back on the right track, as they would want?
Yeah. Well, one super practical thing is relationships are going to be formed where you are. If it's a good thing or a bad, doesn't really
Yeah.
matter. In the place you find yourself, you're going to form relationships. So
Yep.
what's going to happen at the very beginning is, if I do hear that kind of thing, know that there's a journey ahead of them, because there's going to be resistance to be involved in the worst, whatever it might be. And I think I'm a youth pastor, but I would still say the weekend worship setting is a bigger deal than a youth group is.
Yeah.
I don't think youth
I
groups
agree.
are useless,
Right.
but I think that's a bigger question.
Yeah.
And so I'd say, if you can't get there, there's a problem. Um, but if your kids are resisting it, it's probably because they have relationships in one place and not the other place, where there's no way to get those relationships rather than being in that other place. And there's going to be a time of transitional pain. There's
Yeah.
just no way to deny it.
Yeah.
And you're going to have to go through it. And it may come with, like, hey, we're going to do this for a period of time. We're not giving up on it, but we're going to have rewards. We're going to go to
Yeah.
get ice cream together, or Starbucks together, and we're going to talk about it and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Um, that's one thing. I think another thing is encouraging parents that, look, you're the gardener of your child's identity. Your influence in this regard, is going to wane over time, but now's the time to begin putting the skills of cultivation and pruning to work. Um, like your son, your daughter is planted, like as a plant. They're planted in a variety of groups, and so they're going to bear fruit as a certain type of plant.
Yeah.
And what you need to do is, when you see good fruit that you think needs to be pruning, you cultivate that. When you see bad fruit, you prune. Um, Pruning can be drastic. Some branches just need trimmed. But fortunately, if you need wisdom as a parent, you can ask the good gardener. I think that's a big deal, because groups form identity.
Yeah.
And if you're concerned about your young person seeing themselves as only an athlete, as not as somebody who belongs to Jesus, you need to put them in the soil that's going to help them form a more complete, more accurate identity. Um, we do see it all the time. Like, I purposely don't coach a club sport, because I think there are some really good clubs and there's some really good club coaches, but um, clubs can easily overstep the boundaries when it comes to weekend involvement, when it comes to expenses, because a lot of times they have to pay for their facilities,
Yeah.
um, and they have to pay salaries for their folks. And like a lot of things, it can begin to be about the young people, and it can become about the institution or the adults.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, the young people are a tool to help those things continue to survive.
Right.
I have become a great so I don't coach in club system. I coach girls volleyball in the fall. That's when the school year happens.
Yeah.
And I love school coaches. some of them are the same as the club coaches, but there's
Yep.
a limited season. I know that there's open gyms during the school year or like in the off times, but that's different. They're not charging exorbitant rates usually for kids to be involved.
Right.
And a lot of these folks are teachers and they know young people and they want to see the best in young people's lives. So
Yeah.
I really champion the school sports.
Yep.
Um, and yeah, I know some people are like, well, but the AAU team or the club soccer team or the club volleyball team is much more competitive, and that's going to get my kid the scholarship. I mean, I can't go into detail now, but go to NCAA's website and look up the chances of your kid getting a scholarship.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if you are not 6'5" and above, depending on the sport, or have the past of you yourself as a parent being in a professional athlete or a D1 athlete, the chances get so much smaller.
Yes.
Um, and if you're doing club, you're probably putting in a good bit of money in travel. Now, some people, it's a ministry.
Yeah.
Some people, that's where they cultivate their relationships. And that's why, I mean, you got to be, as a family, you got to be in close relationship with God because maybe he is going to be calling some people to that.
Yeah.
And then I think as a congregation, they need to gather around those folks. And those folks need to be open to their congregation's involvement
Yeah.
and just be like, hey, this, I know this is what God's calling us to. Or can you pray with us? I think this is what God's calling us to, but we need to do this together. Like I
Yeah.
can't go out on my own.
Yeah.
I know a while ago I said there's two things. So if anybody's listening wondering for that second thing, I can't remember what it is. So
That's all right.
I'm
I
sorry. Maybe we covered it.
One of the things I love about sports is the discipleship potential.
Hmm.
And the as a youth pastor, I'm not coaching the teams, but showing up to a game is like pouring gas on that fire. It
Hmm.
just skyrockets that relationship with that kid, and
Yeah.
just totally. There was a kid. I mean, we could say we could share stories back and forth till we're blue in the face, but I had a kid who didn't come to youth group because he didn't like it. Very apprehensive about faith, has some trauma stuff, dad stuff, parent stuff, whatever. The last thing he wants is another social group where someone's going to tell him how to live, tell
Yeah.
him what to do. So wasn't showing up to anything. I went to 2 basketball games, and he was at youth group every week the rest of the year, and he was texting me and Facebook messaging and hey, can we hang out? Hey, can we? So then it turned into a regular meeting of hey, yeah, how you doing? How's life going? Let's go get dinner. Let's chat. Um, Sports are an incredibly powerful tool that I think we put into this category of they're not this is pulling them from our thing, so this is evil,
Yeah.
and that's just not the case. It's
No. And when you're in youth ministry, and I'm sure you felt this, like as much as we can tell ourselves this is not the truth, when a student does not show up to a meeting, sometimes you feel rejected. And
yeah,
you have to deal with that. And you're like, well, why don't they like me?
yep,
Um, and then all of a sudden the sport becomes the enemy.
yep,
And then you get real bitter as a youth minister. And we need to be careful about that and understand that we can't approach those situations out of our own bitterness or our lack of hurt. We need to deal with that and then
yep,
wade in alongside people. So, and I've done my fair share of handling it well, but also handling it very poorly in that regard. Um,
yeah.
so
I mean, it
yeah.
goes back to that identity. If my identity as a youth pastor is in youth group numbers or
Hmm.
whatever, and kids aren't showing up because you're right, it does paint sports as the enemy. But you hit the nail on that. I would rather have a kid show up to church and not show up to youth group ever than the other way around,
Yeah.
because they'll have that understanding of the church is the thing. Youth group is just the short term. Youth group is
Yeah.
for now. The church is
Yeah.
forever.
And I would just want to kind of add to what you said, though. It's not just the program that happens at the weekend service, but it's exposure to those multi-generational relationships.
Yep.
So I would say not getting into the building and out of the building, because that can easily be replaced by an online service, but the relationships can't, and that's the reality.
Yeah.
So it's being involved in that weekend worship service so that you can be embedded in that community.
Great.
Um,
That's good.
yeah. No, not that our youth ministries ignore that kind of thing. I think when we do them well, young people are in relationship with each other and with caring adults
Yeah.
that have received some training to be able to walk alongside of them and disciple them better. But yeah, no, I mean, it's Christians, we quote this movie all the time, but back in the 80s, there was a movie that came out called Chariots of Fire, and is a really cool musical theme,
Yeah.
that kind of stuff. And but all the time it talks about the story of Eric Liddell, who was one of the athletes on, I believe, England or Scotland, or I don't know how they were formed at the time, the British Olympic team. And he was a sprinter, I think. And his famous line is, "When I run, I feel God's pleasure." But part of what the movie dealt with is the fact that I think it was the final for his race during the Olympics, took place on a Sunday, and he refused to run.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Um, and so some people just go, "What do you mean? You could have won the medal." And some people are like, "Man, great choice." Um, Really, the choice came down to him. It was his choice. He made it. Um, but that when I run, I feel God's pleasure. I mean, I think a lot of us are like that. Like when I hoop, I feel God's. I don't, but some people who can do it well.
Yeah.
When I play volleyball, when I dribble the soccer ball, whatever it might be, I feel God's pleasure. That's beautiful.
Yeah.
That's a good thing. Um, but you know, there needs to be discipleship. There needs to be a rooted in the kingdom of God and the relationships that He's gifted us with other spirit inhabited people.
Right.
So
Yeah. I really think the conversation is less of an either or and more of a both and.
yeah, and sports can become an idol.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Like what you want to a way to recognize an idol in your life is what stirs our emotions in unhealthy ways. What gets us anxious, what gets us depressed, what gets us angry. Um, if as an athlete or as a parent who has an athlete, if you can't get over that bad call, which was probably a fine call, but just didn't go your
Right.
way, um, then it might be a sign that sports is idolatrous
Yeah.
in your life. Or what do we worship? What do we give our resources to?
Yeah.
That's a sign of worship. So, we need to be careful with those things
Yeah.
too. Oh,
Yeah. That's good. Yeah. I mean, idolatry rears its ugly head in a lot of different ways. And I mean, sports isn't the biggest idol in our world. I would say it's probably this. Um,
yeah. I asked students what that is recently, like a
yeah.
large group of students, and that was overwhelmingly the answer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. There was an illustration. I can't remember where I saw it, but it said if you took a penny, you had two jars or however many jars you want, but you have a jar for your relationship with God. You have a jar for your relationship with your phone, with your relationship with school, with your sport, however many jars you want. And you put a penny in for every hour you spent focusing on that thing, which jar has the most money in it. And that really reveals a lot about where your heart is, right?
Oh yeah.
And that's, I mean, the phone gets a lot of pennies. The phone gets a lot of pennies.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, no, that's good stuff. Any final thoughts on sports, faith, church, discipleship?
I think I
I think
gave you my best stuff,
we
and
got some good stuff there.
it may not be suitable.
That
Um,
was great.
uh, yeah. Again, I don't. Yeah,
You,
I don't think I have anything else.
no, that was I really wish, and I'll go back through this and take some notes because there were a lot of little gold nuggets. And I actually call those BK nuggets because every
Yeah,
time we talk, I get a little BK nugget. And
yeah, yeah.
um,
Little Gold Nugget was my nickname in middle school. So
all right. Well, before things go spiral too far, we're going to wrap it up. BK, you're a legend. You're the GOAT. Thanks for taking some time today. Uh,
no, whoever's watching this, Bobby Collar is the goat.
well, he is the GOAT. That's true. We'll get Bobby sometime soon, too. Uh, this has been In Real Time. And until next time, have a great day.
All right, man. Good chatting with you.